Welcome to the Property Corner with myself, Rowan Alexander. On this episode, we're going to be unpacking co-ownership and joint property purchasing options. Okay, so joint property ownership or co-ownership is becoming more and more prevalent as people struggle to raise the capital to purchase a property, whether it be in the form of the purchase price or the costs associated with that acquisition. I want to look at the different options that you do have if you are considering joint ownership or co-ownership, and maybe just have a look at some of the advantages, disadvantages, and things that you can maybe do in advance to safeguard yourself and to execute that joint ownership in the best possible way. So firstly, what is co-ownership or joint ownership? It's the scenario where multiple people own a singular property without the property actually being divided into portions. So, if myself and my wife were to purchase a property jointly, both of our names would be on the ownership title. And it doesn't necessarily have to be registered in a 50-50 manner. It could be registered 80% in her name, 20% in my name, or pure 50-50 split. You have that ability to stipulate the ownership structure, as to who owns what percentage of that property. So that would be a case where you directly invest in the property jointly. And we'll look into that a little bit closer when that's suitable. And then we'll also be looking at different ways in which you could purchase jointly, but maybe through looking at property in the form of a trust or a company, where you could use a legal body as an intermediary between the owners of the property and the property. It just gives you a vehicle to be able to trade and maybe adapt in certain scenarios that may be more desirable. Co-ownership in its simplest form can be explained by if me and you own a vehicle jointly, nowhere do we stipulate that the left seat belongs to me and the right seat belongs to you. The left wheel, right wheel. We own the entire vehicle, jointly, and we both have the right to use it unless we have some form of an agreement that one has exclusivity. And that's exactly the same concept when it comes to co-ownership in property. Something to remember that if you do purchase property jointly and you fail to stipulate what percentages would be allocated to every party, it will be assumed that each party owns the property equally. So in the case of 4 purchases, if you fail to stipulate what share percentage each one has, it will be registered 25% per shareholder. Now that might seem logical, but in some instances you may have one shareholder that's contributed a larger financial portion of the purchase price and costs, and you may want to give them a 50% share and the remaining 50% divided between 2 other shareholders. So it's always important. That's something which I was caught out with, and it was a simple case where I invested with 2 or 3 other parties, and our intention was myself and a separate shareholder were each supposed to have 25%, and then the other 2 shareholders were a husband and wife, making up the 4. They were actually married in community of property. We made the mistake that without stipulating that each one should actually have 25%, and effectively the in-community couple should have owned 50%, myself 25%, and the other shareholder 25%. What ended up happening was the joint purchases or the married couple that are married in community of property were seen as a singular legal entity in the contract. 1/3 was registered into their name, 1/3 into my name, and 1/3 into the other shareholder's name. So that was done incorrectly. And the only way to rectify that is to actually re-register that property or go through a deeds office process to get that rectified. So if you are going to be purchasing jointly, be sure that you do stipulate the percentages that you want to be registered in each one's name. Else failing to do so, the assumption will be made that each one will own equal shares. That portion that you own as a joint or shared owner in a property can be sold or traded freely as long as the other partners agree to that sale or lease. So it does also give you that ability that if one partner wants to dispose of their share in the property, it can be purchased by the other shareholders or it can be sold to a new party. Bearing in mind that if you do that, the new party that comes into the agreement, will need to work along with the existing shareholders. And that's why you would require their approval for the sale of that share. So some of the advantages of co-ownership is that you have a shared responsibility, you have a shared input, whereby you can share in the knowledge and the ideas and the opinions of multiple people. If those are good, and you choose the correct partners, it's something that can be very strong. Partnerships have shown in many different forms that there's value to having partners. And in the same way, in property, it's important that you choose your correct partners and that those visions are aligned. We'll touch on sort of good and best practices when getting into joint property ownership shortly. But just another one of those advantages that you have when purchasing jointly is that you could possibly get into the property market earlier than what you would have if you were to do it alone. And I'll give a real practical example in my own life. In my first year of starting to work after my studies, I was in a position where I wanted to acquire a property, but I wasn't able to qualify for the bond on my own. At the same time, my parents were looking to purchase a property as an investment, but they also didn't really qualify on their own for what they were after. We ended up buying that property jointly, and we rented it out for about 5 years. 5 years later, I moved into the property. I occupied it for a time being, paid my rent to them as co-owners, paid their portion of the rent. And then a number of years thereafter, I then purchased their portion of that property too. Today, I rent that property out, and that property has served 3 different functions in its time, that we've owned it. Initially, it was an investment property for us as joint purchasers. Then it became a residence for me at a certain point in time. And today it's an investment property again. So out of the single property, we've managed to have 3 different functions over a 12-year period. And every time we've changed that functionality or the use of that property, we haven't paid any transfer duty, we haven't paid any transfer costs, or paid less transfer costs because I've only purchased the half share. But for 2 of the changes, there were no cost involved. Only in the 3rd one did I pay a proportional cost. Now, if I had disposed of that property and reinvested and disposed of it and reinvested every time, it would have cost me a lot of money. Whereas that one single property was able to serve multiple functions over that 12-year period. And that's another thing that co-ownership does give you. It gives you options, options that you can execute, where you can acquire or dispose within existing shareholder structure, which can be very beneficial. By getting into the market earlier than what you would have on your own, you have that benefit of initially getting some of the capital growth that you would have missed out on. 10 years worth of capital growth on a property where you would have been sitting on the sideline, even if it's on a smaller amount, is still a significant amount of money. I've found in my career that very few people can save at the same rate as which property values escalate. So it's going to be hard for you to try and save at that rate. And that's why to get in, even if it is in the form of co-ownership, is a very attractive option. So if you're wanting to go down this route of co-ownership, I think there's some basic principles that I can share that would be good to enforce or to consider before you enter into that, because you can learn from my experiences, you can learn from my clients' experiences. People don't want to plan for when things go wrong. When people enter into co-ownership agreements, they generally assume that life will be good. And in reality, the circumstances change, people's needs change, life happens. And it's important that you have some form of a shareholders agreement or a co-purchaser agreement, which stipulates how you will deal with things when plans are not executed in accordance with your initial sort of intentions. What happens if someone can't pay their portion of the property? How long do you intend keeping it? These are all sort of questions that you can ask. And I've got a list here that I've made of ideas or questions that you should ask in the process of concluding your co-ownership agreement. So in what portion will the property be shared? Will it be on an equal basis, or will there be some differentiation? Does any of the partners, or do any of the partners have the sole right to the use of the property? Or, will this property be leased out? What is that? It could be a holiday home, as an example. It could be a vacation property where, you have rotating, availability for different shareholders. So things like that, become important. Who will contribute towards the initial payments? Will everybody contribute towards the deposit requirements? I've seen agreements where someone pays the deposit and the other pays the equivalent in deposit, sort of in bond installments. Or so you need to look at, is everyone going to contribute at the same point in time, not just the amount, but at what point in time everyone contributes. Who will contribute, sort of what amount, and whether it's once off on an ongoing basis. I think that's what I'm trying to say. Then again, what will happen when that property is sold? How will those profits be split? Is there any sort of intention or right to draw down against the bond if it is eventually paid off, or if it is paid off or paid in advance? What is that idea? Would the shareholders like their money to be reimbursed to them? That initial loan that they've made to this purchase. What happens in the case of a breakdown between the parties, of relationship? Is there a stipulated agreement that says that if this relationship breaks down to a point of no return, is the property then disposed and the money shared? Does one have the option to purchase the other out? How is that value then determined? And good ways in which you can get around this is to stipulate that 3 valuations will be done and a average value will be taken between the valuations. And there's ways in which you can get around this. What happens in the case of death or incapacity of one of the shareholders? This is something that we don't want to think about, and it's things which are very often uncomfortable to speak about. But if you do it up front, it will make the dealing with that in that eventuality so much easier along the line. And then again, dispute resolutions. How will disputes be resolved before you get to the point of litigation or summons? Is there a mechanism? How will voting rights work? These are things which you can consider. And then how can this agreement be terminated? How can that co-ownership agreement be terminated? If you've asked those questions and you've considered the things that I've brought up before, like, how will you regulate the sale of one person's share? If you've considered these things, I think you've got a pretty sound basis for co-ownership or joint purchasing. And with this example that we've been using, this would apply to whether you purchase jointly in your own capacity personally. And a lot of these principles can be transferred into co-ownership in the form of a legal entity, whereby that legal entity purchases the property, be it a trust or a company, and then you have shareholding in that company, or you are a trustee in that trust, for whom you are setting up the trust, the ultimate beneficiaries. The same questions I think you can apply to those forms of ownership too. Each of them have a different function and will be executed in a different way, depending upon what your end goal is. But the co-ownership, the fundamentals of co-ownership will always stay the same. So I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope that's been useful. And I'd encourage you to get into the property market as quickly as possible, even if it is through the form of co-ownership. I often find that people want to own something themselves and have it exclusively. And by having that mindset, are often excluded from opportunities where they could have seen good growth. They could have had a kickstart. They could have had, a boost, in getting them to exclusive ownership a lot quicker. In my life, I've got numerous partnerships and co-ownerships in properties in the form of direct, sort of personal ownership through trusts, companies. It's been very good to me, and that relationship between shareholders, as long as it is aligned, as long as it is well planned, as long as it's considered and everyone's visions are aligned, it's easy to set up those co-ownership agreements and have those difficult discussions up front, when things don't go according to plan. I mean, a simple principle that myself and two other partners in a investment company have taken is to say that our contributions to the property we put in upfront. We don't pay it monthly. We put it in upfront, and once that money is up, in servicing the bond every month, once that money is up, we will then make a decision as to whether we reinvest or we sell the property. But we're not going to be paying monthly, everyone contributing monthly, because if something then goes wrong, one of those owners, one of the shareholders is going to feel pressurized to, take over the installment of the other. So we put the money in up front. We have a separate account, and every month that bond is deducted from that account, rather than one of the shareholders having to collect the money from the others. That is an upfront commitment for a stipulated period of time. And we will then vote and decide once that money is up, whether we reinvest or sell that property. It's a simple way to remove one of the associated risks of, the eventuality that someone is not able to pay anymore. That money's been invested for a certain amount of time. And there's things like this that can be done. If you're looking for advice on your co-ownership agreements and how to deal with these sort of things, you're welcome to drop a comment down below, and we'll see how we can advise and provide our opinion on that matter. So hope you've enjoyed this, and you can use this advice to your benefit.